The weapons in TF2 are balanced to be side grades to each other, better in some situations, but worse in others. Or at least, this is the case for 66% of the weapons. The melee weapons are often the outlier in this design philosophy. While primary and secondary weapons usually have clear trade-offs to one another, melee weapons tend to be either strictly better than stock or completely outclassed. Because of how the game is designed, the melee weapons are nearly useless for most of the classes. Why would you bother swinging your bat or swinging your shovel when you could just shoot them with a scattergun or a rocket launcher? In almost every situation, it is more effective to reload and keep firing than to close the gap for a melee attack. This makes stock melees feel redundant. If a weapon is meant to be a last resort, but you never need to resort to it, then it serves little purpose. You see, when you have a look at some of the most popular melee unlocks, they all provide some kind of utility, rather than just being a weapon, whether it's a speed boost or some other passive effect. These melees aren't used because they're good at dealing damage, they're used because they offer something valuable outside of combat. Since the stock melee weapons lack this kind of utility, they often get ignored in favour for options that provide a tangible benefit. Not only this, but take a look at some of these downsides. 20% slower firing speed, a small damage vulnerability. These barely matter when melee combat is so situational to begin with. If you're rarely using your melee weapon for direct combat, then a slower attack speed or taking more damage when holding it is hardly a real trade-off. This leads to weapons that essentially have free benefits with no meaningful downside. Hell, the third degree literally has no downside. It is a straight upgrade to stock, allowing you to hit multiple enemies through healing beams with no penalty. And yet, despite this, it is one of the worst melee weapons in the game, simply because it is an offensive melee weapon on Pyro, a class that already thrives in close quarters combat with their primary weapons. Even with no drawback, the weapon sees no use because of the fundamental issue remains. Melee combat is not practical for most classes. This imbalance creates a weird dynamic, where melee weapons are either must-picks for their utility, or completely irrelevant. Instead of being meaningful choices, most melee weapons fall into one of these two extremes. A well-balanced game should encourage variety, but in TF2, melee slots are often predetermined. Why would you take the fire axe over the power jack, the bone saw over the uber saw? The melee slot is not about preference or playstyle, it's about whether you want something that does something useful or not. Now this leads to a lack of decision making when it comes to melee loadouts. With primary and secondary weapons, you at least have different playstyles to consider. But for melees, it's usually a case of, does this give me a free benefit? And if the answer is yes, you equip it, and if not, you ignore it. There's no reason to take stock melee weapons outside of pure stubbornness or specific gimmicks, which is a problem, where TF2 is all about side grades and choice. Now, when you ignore the stock melee weapons, things are not as bad. Most classes have at least one or two, or maybe even three solid options that fit different playstyles, which is what weapon balance should look like. Take Soldier for example. He's got the escape plan for mobility, the Market Gardener for insane burst damage if he could land the hit, and the disciplinary action for team support. Each of these weapons serves a unique purpose, and none of them completely invalidate the others. Similarly, Pyro has the Power Jack for speed, and the Home Wrecker for utility, and even the Back Scratcher for a risky, self-sufficient playstyle. These options usually make melee choices interesting, because they provide different benefits depending on how you want to play. The problem is that not every class gets this kind of balance. Some are stuck with one clearly superior option, while others don't even get a meaningful choice to begin with. Take Medic, where the Uberstore is so overwhelmingly good that almost every other option feels like a joke in comparison. This creates an uneven distribution of melee viability, where some classes have interesting choices, and others are stuck with a single dominant pick. This inconsistency makes the melee slot feel like an afterthought, rather than an important part of a class's loadout. With primary and secondary weapons, there's at least an attempt to balance them around different playstyles, but melee weapons feel like they were designed with no real direction. Some are overpowered with barely any trade-offs, and some are completely useless, and others just exist without any real purpose. The result is a melee system where most players either pick the good one, or just ignore the slot entirely. Now, this isn't an easy problem to fix. Melee weapons are inherently a disadvantage in TF2 because of how it plays. Closing the gap to land a melee hit is always riskier than just shooting. If Valve were to buff melee weapons to make them more viable in direct combat, they'd risk making them too strong and turning TF2 into medieval mode. Which isn't what the game is fun for. At the same time, nerfing the utility-based melees to make stock more appealing would just make the slot even less relevant. The core issue is that melee weapons need a reason to exist beyond the last resort, but right now, most of them fail to provide that reason in a way that makes it feel balanced and meaningful. Now, there are two classes that are the exception: the Demoman and Sniper. Not because stock is particularly a good option, rather it's the only option because the alternatives are either too situation or just outright bad. For the Demoman, most of his melee unlocks are designed for Demo Knight, a little niche subclass you might not have heard of before. This means that for a standard Demoman using grenades and stickies, weapons like the Eyelander and the Persian Persuader are almost completely useless. The only real option is the Pain Train, which benefits him in specific objective-based situations. As a result, the bottle ends up being his best general use melee, simply because it has no downside and is always reliable for a last resort. Sniper is in a similar situation. Most of his melee unlocks don't actually help him in a many meaningful way. Things like the Tribalman's Shiv and the Shansha offer very little value when Sniper is almost always better off using his primary or secondary. The only real exception is the Bushwhacker, but even that is dependent on running Jarate, meaning it is basically useless if you're not running anything else. Because of this, stock ends up being his best overall choice by default. Not because it's great, but because everything else is worse or too situational to justify. The fact that the best way to balance out the melee weapons is to make all of them bad says a lot about how flawed the system is. It shouldn't take a complete lack of viable alternatives for a stock melee weapon to feel like a good choice. Ideally, every melee weapon should have a reason to be used, but right now the balance is so lopsided that most of them are either completely dominant or completely ignored. Ultimately, the melee slot in TF2 suffers from a major balancing problem. For most classes, stock melee weapons are useless because better options exist that provide utility or outright advantages with minimal downsides. This inconsistency makes the melee slot feel like less of a balanced part of the game and more like an afterthought. Either your melee weapon does something, or it's a complete waste of a slot. That said, melee still have their moment. While many weapons are clearly superior than others, there are still some fun and interesting choices out there which can change how you play, even if they are not quite as powerful as the more used options. So despite all of this, don't dismiss some of the other options. Why not give some variety to your loadouts? Did I get anything wrong? Disagree with my opinions? Think I missed something? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video or found it interesting, consider giving it a like, sharing it, and possibly even subscribing. And thank you for getting to the end.